In the Far East, Japan continued to win its war against China, which had started in 1937. Japanese military force expanded across the Pacific Ocean into the Marianas, Gilbert, Marshall, and Solomon Island chains. Such blatant aggression strained relations with the United States. In 1941, President Roosevelt issued an oil embargo against Japan, and relations between the two countries grew worse. Yet Americans were reluctant to fight a war. Japan solved that lack of enthusiasm by launching a surprise attack against the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japanese planes dropped their first bombs and torpedoes shortly before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941. 2 hours later, 18 ships of the Pacific Fleet were either sunk, run aground, or badly damaged. About 2,300 soldiers and sailors were killed, and another 1,100 wounded.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Suddenly, the United States was at war with Japan and its allies, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy.
Completely on a war footing goes all the nation. Troops on guard at vital spots in the
country. Things looked bad for the Allies all over the world. The Germans dominated Europe, gained much ground in Russia, and captured 33,000 British soldiers at Tobruk in North Africa. Once again, Rommel was winning the Desert War. In the Pacific, Japanese forces captured Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. They defeated General Douglas MacArthur and his troops in the Philippines, capturing 11,000 men at Bataan and Corregidor. But the war in the Pacific was just beginning. It would prove to be a terrible test of U.S. military strength and courage.
The problem of the war itself becomes very complex because the war in the Pacific, if you listen to or read accounts by people, GIs, Americans who participated, the war in the Pacific was peculiarly ferocious. And part of the ferocity of that war was the fighting. It simply was incredibly intense. Part of it was the environment. The jungle was an enemy. The whole environment was horrendous, and it was hellish. And so the fighting itself took on a hellish quality.
An important turning point in the Pacific War came in June 1942, when the U.S. Navy scored a tremendous victory over the Japanese fleet off the island of Midway, sinking 4 enemy aircraft carriers and destroying or damaging many other ships. During the entire battle, the two fleets never fired guns at one another. All the attacks were carried out by aircraft. Naval aviation had become a critical component of warfare. The Pacific. The Germans began to lose their undersea campaign in the Atlantic. At one time, U-boats were so fearless that they hovered just off the eastern seaboard of the United States, torpedoing merchant ships soon after they left port. By May 1943, U.S. and British naval forces were terrorizing Hitler's submarine fleet and destroying U-boats by the dozen. In North Africa, the Desert Fox was on the run with his battered and poorly supplied Africa Corps. At the Battle of El Alamein in the autumn of 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery and his troops scored a decisive victory against Rommel's Africa Corps. The victory guaranteed the safety of the Suez Canal and spelled the end of German power in North Africa. Finally, the British had something to cheer about.
Rommel's army has been defeated. It has been routed It has been very largely destroyed as a fighting force. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
On the Eastern Front, Hitler's army was also being turned back in the pivotal year of 1943. In February, the Red Army came out on top of a horrible 7-month struggle against the Germans in the city of Stalingrad. Situated on the Volga River in southern Russia, the city was a major center for transportation and communication. A key objective the Germans needed to capture on their way to the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus region.
Stalingrad
had a very important strategic significance. The Nazis threw everything they had at the city. Stalingrad was constantly bombed. The battle for Stalingrad was the worst battle in the Second World War.
The German 6th Army, under General Friedrich von Paulus, spearheaded the attack against Stalingrad, while the Luftwaffe bombed the city mercilessly, killing about 40,000 people, most of them civilians. It took a month of desperate house-to-house fighting to win control of the city center, but the Soviet soldiers fought back doggedly.
Our command concentrated up to 10 cannon on each 100 feet along the front line, and we fired for 40 minutes. After that barrage, we counterattacked.
The Soviet counterattack at Stalingrad succeeded in surrounding General Paulus and 300,000 troops. Slowly, they were squeezed tighter and tighter by the Red Army. The temperatures dropped to 30 below zero in an extremely bitter Russian winter. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight until every man in his command was dead. The general disobeyed and surrendered his remaining 91,000 troops to the Soviets.
There were two armies, one at Stalingrad and one along the Don front. When they met, it meant a total victory over the fascist army at Stalingrad.
In the Pacific, the U.S. Marines were pushing the Japanese back toward Tokyo in an island-hopping campaign that featured desperate fighting on beaches and in jungles. Navy task forces carrying Army and Marine divisions targeted one island after the other: Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each piece of real estate was purchased with great quantities of blood and human life that was always too high. 1944 began with U.S. and British forces pushing German troops out of Italy. The Italian army had already surrendered, with Mussolini removed from power and imprisoned. Later, he was rescued by German commandos. On June 4th, 1944, Allied forces marched into Rome. Mussolini and his army were long gone, and Hitler's backdoor attempt to save the Italian front only delayed the inevitable for several months. 2 days later, the largest amphibious invasion ever mounted took place on the beaches of Normandy. The German army had turned the coastline of Nazi Europe into a 1,200-mile-long death trap of mines, barbed wire, tank traps, machine guns, and artillery. The responsibility for getting disparate personalities to agree on a basic plan for invading France fell upon General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. An important part of the Normandy invasion was the element of surprise. British and U.S. intelligence units spent a great deal of effort convincing the Germans that the main thrust of the invasion would be led by General George S. Patton, and that the landing would take place at Calais. General Rommel, his Desert Fox days behind him, now commanded German coastal defenses in France. He correctly predicted that Normandy would be the invasion site, but his superior believed the invasion would come at Calais. So did Hitler. When the Allies arrived at Normandy, the Germans failed to react immediately with a counterattack by their armored panzer divisions. This delay gave the Allied troops a precious chance in the first critical hours to gain a foothold on the beach and advance inland. The invasion armada was made up of 150,000 men on board 5,300 ships and landing craft. The amphibious assault was preceded by a withering air attack. More than 10,000 Allied aircraft took part in it. Many landing craft were sunk or grounded on their way to shore.